The month of July in the year 1944 hung over the Normandy landscape like a thick woolen blanket. The air was entirely stagnant. It carried the heavy scent of crushed apples from the surrounding orchards, mingled with the chalky dust of pulverized limestone and the raw metallic tang of spilled blood. East of the ruined city of Saint-Lô, the terrain transformed into a suffocating labyrinth known as the bocage. These were not mere rows of bushes planted by modern farmers. These were ancient earthen barricades, centuries of history compacted into towering walls of dense soil and heavy river stones. Generations of French peasants had piled the earth higher and higher to mark their property lines, dating all the way back to the Roman occupation. Over hundreds of years, wild hawthorn intertwined with thick, gnarly oak roots and vicious blackberry brambles. They wove a solid, impenetrable wooden armor over the dirt banks. The sunken lanes between these massive walls were dark and damp even at high noon. A man could walk down a dirt road and see absolutely nothing but green walls rising 15 feet on either side. It was a landscape designed by history to swallow armies whole. Deep inside one of these ancient wooden fortresses, an elite veteran of the German Waffen-SS lay entirely motionless. He pressed his stomach flat against the cool, damp earth. He was a survivor of the catastrophic winter battles on the Eastern Front. He knew the intimate, freezing embrace of the Russian snow, and he knew the terrifying sound of incoming Soviet artillery. Now he found himself baking in the stifling French summer heat. He had not moved a single voluntary muscle in 6 straight hours. A large black beetle crawled slowly across the back of his sun-baked hand, navigating the fine blonde hairs and the caked grime. He did not flinch. He did not brush it away. His breathing was so shallow that the fabric covering his ribs barely registered a rise and fall. He was practically dead to the physical world around him. He had become an organic extension of the ancient hedgerow. He peered through a tiny, natural gap in the twisted hawthorn branches, watching the empty dirt road ahead. His weapon was perfectly still. The cold-blued steel barrel of his rifle was carefully wrapped in strips of burlap to kill any stray reflection from the fierce afternoon sun. The true magic of his invisibility lay draped across his shoulders. He wore a heavy, reversible cotton duck smock printed in a revolutionary camouflage pattern. To the uneducated eye, the fabric looked like a random spillage of dye. But it was a masterpiece of optical warfare engineered by Professor Otto Schick. Schick was not a military tactician. He was an art professor from Munich who understood the profound flaws in human perception. Before the war, the professor had spent countless solitary hours sitting perfectly still in the deep Bavarian forests. He watched intensely as beams of sunlight pierced the high canopy and fractured into thousands of irregular glowing patches on the forest floor. He realized that the human brain is a biological machine heavily hardwired for pattern recognition. A soldier walking through a forest is not truly seeing every leaf. His brain is frantically scanning for sharp, unnatural geometric edges. The straight line of a rifle barrel, the perfect curved dome of a stamped steel helmet, the solid, dark block of a human torso. If a soldier spots one of those shapes, his brain immediately separates the man from the background. Schick designed his camouflage to violently disrupt that specific biological process. He completely abandoned the traditional solid colors used by other armies. Instead, he created a chaotic canvas of blurred, irregular shapes. Deep shadow browns, vibrant summer greens, dead autumn ochres. He overlaid these colors in jagged, fragmented clusters that perfectly mimicked the dappled effect of sunlight filtering through blowing leaves. When the elite German infantrymen slipped these heavy canvas smocks over their field-gray tunics and pulled the matching covers over their iconic helmets, a terrifying transformation occurred. The hard edges of the human silhouette simply dissolved. The solid form was broken into dozens of floating, disconnected color fragments. As this veteran lay buried in the tangled roots of the bocage, the fabric absorbed the shifting summer sunlight. The irregular brown patches melted into the damp earth, while the green fragments vanished against the living leaves. He ceased to be flesh and blood. He became a ghost woven out of cotton and dye. The German High Command in Berlin possessed supreme confidence in this optical illusion. They had spent the agonizing weeks of June watching this very camouflage decimate the advancing British infantry. The British military fought a highly structured and traditional war. Their commanding officers adhered strictly to a doctrine they called bite and hold. It was a methodical system relying on massive, coordinated artillery strikes, followed by a slow, disciplined advance of infantry sections. A British rifle squad would step cautiously into a field of tall grass, their heavy, hobnailed boots crunching rhythmically against the dry earth. The soldiers gripped their Lee Enfield rifles tightly with white knuckles, their eyes darting frantically back and forth across the terrifying wall of green vegetation looming in front of them. They were hunting for a shape. They were desperately searching for any visual confirmation of the enemy. A shadow moving against the wind. A glint of sunlight hitting a brass belt buckle. A face peering out from the leaves. Their entire tactical manual rested upon one fundamental requirement. They had to positively identify the target before they could engage. They needed to see the enemy in order to shoot the enemy. And so the German soldiers simply waited. They lay buried deep inside the dark earthen banks, breathing the smell of wet chalk and decaying roots. They waited patiently as the British soldiers stepped closer and closer. When the enemy was so close that the German riflemen could see the terrified sweat beading on the British faces, they finally squeezed their triggers. A sharp, violent crack of a rifle would tear through the peaceful orchard. A British soldier would instantly collapse backward into the blood-stained grass. Before the surviving squad members could even throw themselves to the ground and raise their weapons, the unseen shooter had already vanished. The thin wisp of grey smoke escaping the hot muzzle was immediately swallowed by the thick leaves. The British would pour thousands of rounds of return fire blindly into the bushes, but the ghost was already gone. Tens of thousands of young men from London and Manchester and Liverpool were killed or maimed by an enemy they never once laid eyes on. This overwhelming success bred a fatal arrogance within the German military elite. They built their entire defensive strategy in Normandy around a single flawed assumption. If the enemy cannot see you, the enemy cannot hit you. And that arrogant assumption brings us right back to the motionless veteran lying under the hawthorn tree on this sweltering July afternoon. He is perfectly hidden. He is absolutely confident in his mastery of the environment. No American scout has walked down the sunken road. No forward observer with heavy brass binoculars has pointed a finger at his position. The woods are entirely silent save for the buzzing of the cicadas. And then the sky rips open. There is no warning whistle. There is no time to flinch or scramble backward into the dirt. An 81mm high, explosive mortar round drops straight down from the clouds and detonates exactly 10 feet above his helmet. The deafening blast instantly shatters the thick wooden canopy. The ancient hawthorn branches are reduced to thousands of flying wooden splinters. The perfect oak leaf camouflage cannot stop jagged steel shrapnel tearing through the air at supersonic speeds. The veteran is killed instantly in a blinding flash of fire and dirt. A few hours later, his surviving squad mate sits shivering in a muddy prisoner of war pen operated by the 1st United States Army. The captured German looks at his interrogators with wide, terrified eyes. He tells them a story that makes absolutely no logical sense to his battlefield experience. He fiercely insists that they were perfectly hidden. He swears on his life that no American soldier ever laid eyes on their position. He begs to know how an advancing army can pinpoint and utterly obliterate a target they have absolutely no way of seeing. Why did the ultimate concealment fail so catastrophically against this specific enemy? The answer lies in the fundamental difference between the armies. The Americans, stepping on to the European continent, did not possess sharper eyes. They did not carry magical optical equipment. They simply brought a ruthless, practical, and utterly terrifying new doctrine to the battlefield. They did not care if they could see the ghost. They were going to burn the entire haunted forest to the ground. The American soldiers, stepping cautiously down the muddy cattle trails of Normandy, did not carry the aristocratic military heritage of the Prussian Guard. They were farm boys from the vast, sweeping wheat fields of Kansas. They were grease-covered mechanics from the noisy automobile garages of Detroit. They were hardened steel workers from the roaring foundries of Pittsburgh. They brought a distinctly working-class pragmatism to the deadly art of war. If a door was locked, they did not waste precious time politely knocking or meticulously searching for the hidden key. They simply kicked the heavy wooden frame off its hinges. The United States military recognized early in the conflict that a living, breathing American teenager was infinitely more valuable than a massive warehouse full of cold brass casings. They formalized this raw, practical mindset into a brutal combat doctrine heavily documented and aggressively taught in their field manuals. They called this highly destructive tactic reconnaissance by fire. To comprehend the terrifying reality of this doctrine, one must mentally stand in the muddy boots of a German rifleman completely hidden in the thick brush. The German infantryman was trained to act as a highly disciplined precision instrument. He clutched a Mauser Carabiner 98, a beautifully machined heavy bolt-action rifle with a rich, dark walnut stock. Every single time he wanted to fire a bullet, he had to manually reach up, grab the heavy steel handle, lift it upward, rotate it, pull it violently backward to eject the spent brass casing, shove it aggressively forward to strip a new live round from the internal magazine and push it back down to lock the breech. It was a slow, deliberate mechanical ritual that required physical effort and broke his line of sight. Because of this slow, deliberate rate of fire, the German soldier was drilled relentlessly by his officers to strictly conserve his limited ammunition. He was aggressively instructed never to squeeze the trigger until he had a crystal-clear visual confirmation of a human target. He waited silently in the shadows for the absolute perfect shot. The American infantryman advancing up the sunken dirt lane operated under a completely different mechanical reality. He carried a heavy, brutal masterpiece of modern engineering forged at the massive Springfield Armory, the M1 Garand. It was a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle weighing nearly 10 pounds loaded. The American boy did not need to manually work a heavy steel bolt to load his next shot. The intensely hot, expanding gases from the fired bullet were tapped through a tiny port near the muzzle, driving a long, heavy steel operating rod backward with immense force. The weapon automatically extracted the spent casing, loaded a fresh round, and cocked the hammer in the literal blink of an eye. The American soldier only had to flex his index finger to unleash death. When an American rifle squad moved down a suffocating green corridor, they did not tiptoe in terrified silence, waiting to be ambushed by a hidden sniper. If a thick cluster of blackberry bushes up ahead looked even slightly suspicious, they did not send a brave scout crawling forward on his belly in the mud to investigate. They simply asked the bush a question with high velocity laid. An American soldier raised his heavy wooden rifle tightly to his shoulder and rapidly squeezed the trigger. 8 heavy .30 caliber armor-piercing bullets punched blindly through the dense foliage in less than 3 seconds. The heavy copper-jacketed projectiles snapped thick branches in half and tore green leaves to shredded paste. Instantly following the 8th explosive shot, a sharp metallic ping echoed loudly through the surrounding trees. The empty steel en-bloc clip ejected automatically high into the air, spinning rapidly before clattering sharply against the loose rocks on the dirt road. Before that iconic ringing sound even faded into the heavy, humid summer air, the soldier reached down to his canvas, webbing grabbed a fresh 8-round clip and shoved it violently down into the open receiver with his heavy thumb. The heavy steel bolt slammed shut with a vicious metallic clack, and the relentless firing instantly resumed. Multiply that overwhelming mechanical violence by an entire squad of 12 advancing men. Then add the deep, rhythmic, concussive thumping of the Browning automatic rifle. The American bar gunner carried a massive 20-pound weapon with heavy steel magazines tucked tightly into his canvas belt. He planted his wide leather boots firmly in the slippery mud, braced the heavy wooden stock against his shoulder, and held the trigger down. The weapon chattered with a terrifying, deep-throated roar, sending steady streams of .30 caliber ammunition ripping wildly through the hedgerow. This was a solid, horizontal wall of flying lead moving systematically through the woods. The Americans were not shooting at specific men. They were shooting at the very concept of concealment. They fired blindly into the dark tree lines, into the deep black shadows under the heavy oak roots, and into the thickest patches of creeping ivy. For the elite German veteran perfectly camouflaged in his oak leaf-printed smock, a horrific realization suddenly washed over him. His beautiful, scientific optical illusion was completely meaningless. The camouflage only provided concealment. It successfully hid his physical body from the human eye, but it provided absolutely zero physical cover from a heavy, .30 caliber, armor-piercing bullet, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The dense bushes and thin wooden branches could not stop the incoming horizontal storm of steel. The American bullets chewed effortlessly through the wooden trunks, tore violently through the damp soil, and found the soft, fragile human flesh hiding terrified behind the illusion. The German soldiers were being systematically slaughtered in their holes by an enemy who never even bothered to look for them. The Americans used a sheer, overwhelming volume of fire to literally erase the very environment the enemy was hiding inside. And the foot-mobile infantry was merely the soft edge of this terrifying, blunt instrument. The muddy earth of the sunken road suddenly began to tremble violently. Small, loose pebbles vibrated and danced erratically across the dirt. The stagnant, humid air rapidly filled with the choking, acrid smell of hot diesel exhaust, burning motor oil, and crushed green vegetation. The heavy, guttural roar of a massive V8 engine shook the leaves right off the branches overhead. A 30-ton Sherman tank slowly rounded the bend in the road. Its wide, heavy steel tracks chewed deep into the muddy lane, grinding the fallen wooden branches into a wet, splintered pulp. The intense heat shimmering visibly off the massive rear exhaust grills violently distorted the air, turning the background into a wavy blur. The German soldiers, buried deep in the earthen banks, pressed their faces desperately into the wet dirt. They gripped their magnetic anti-tank mines and heavy Panzerfaust weapons tight, waiting for the American tank commander to pop the heavy steel top hatch open. They waited silently for him to stick his vulnerable head out and carefully scan the tree line with his heavy binoculars. If he looked out, they could shoot him, but the heavy steel hatch remained firmly locked down from the inside. The Sherman tank did not stop to gently investigate the road ahead. The massive internal electric motor engaged with a high-pitched whine, and the heavy steel turret slowly ground its way around. The long, thick barrel of the 75mm main gun pointed directly into the ancient earthen bank. Mounted right beside it, coaxially, was the .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun, a massive weapon originally designed to tear heavy bomber airplanes completely out of the sky. The American gunner, sitting deep inside the dark, suffocating steel belly of the tank, simply stepped down hard on the firing pedal. A deafening, continuous thunderclap completely drowned out the buzzing cicadas and the frantic shouts of the infantry. The heavy .50 caliber gun spit a solid, blinding stream of bright orange tracer rounds directly into the ancient barricade. The massive, half-inch thick bullets did not just pierce the bushes. They physically dismantled the landscape. They snapped ancient solid oak trunks entirely in half, sending massive trees crashing violently down into the sunken road. They churned the packed dirt into loose, blinding dust. They hit the large hidden stones inside the wall and shattered them into thousands of lethal flying rock fragments. The Sherman acted as a heavily armored bulldozer, pushing a literal wall of fire ahead of it. The terrified tank crews did not care if there were actually elite German paratroopers hiding in the roots. They only knew that there could be, and that remote possibility was entirely enough to warrant the complete and total physical destruction of the hedgerow. The German military had spent years perfecting the dark art of the ambush. They had successfully turned concealment into a high optical science, but the Americans simply refused to play the game by those rules. They flatly refused to die quietly while carefully searching for a hidden enemy. They answered the delicate, nuanced art of camouflage with the brutal industrial application of unlimited ammunition. Yet this overwhelming localized destruction on the muddy cattle trails of Normandy was only a tiny fraction of the American war machine. To truly comprehend the apocalyptic scale of the destruction that was about to rain down upon the German military, one must leave the bloody dirt of the front lines. One must travel miles backwards behind the relative safety of the American lines into a highly structured world of complex mathematics, invisible radio waves, and perfectly organized devastation. The German artillery officers commanded their batteries like 19th-century gentlemen practicing a highly refined physical science. To call in an artillery strike, the German army relied on a rigid, methodical, and excruciatingly slow ritual. A German forward observer stood knee-deep in a freezing, muddy trench, gripping heavy brass precision optical rangefinders. He carefully squinted through the crystal-clear Zeiss glass, physically measuring the exact distance to the advancing enemy. He then pulled out a rain-soaked paper map and a complex slide rule. He had to manually calculate the intricate trigonometry. He had to factor in the local wind speed, the barometric pressure, and the temperature of the gunpowder. He then cranked a heavy field telephone to relay these complex mathematical coordinates back to a specific single battery of guns. The entire agonizing process from spotting the target to the first high explosive shell leaving the barrel could take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. In the fluid, terrifying chaos of a modern battlefield, 30 minutes was an absolute eternity. The Americans completely discarded this slow, individualistic methodology. During the quiet, peaceful years of the 1930s, while Europe was busy polishing its aristocratic military traditions, the United States Army was busy building a massive, invisible nervous system. Deep in the dusty, sun-baked plains of Oklahoma, at a military base called Fort Sill, American tactical instructors constructed a centralized mathematical brain. They called it the Fire Direction Center. They realized that individual guns firing independently were terribly inefficient. They wanted to connect every single artillery piece on the entire battlefield into one massive synchronized sledgehammer, and they connected this sprawling network together using the invisible crackling magic of frequency-modulated radio waves. To understand the terrifying power of this system, one must picture a 22-year-old American lieutenant crouching behind a crumbling, moss-covered stone wall in Normandy. His canvas uniform is soaked with sweat and stained with crushed green grass. He is heavily outgunned and entirely pinned down by elite German machine gunners hidden somewhere in the dense, impenetrable hedgerow ahead. The young lieutenant does not know exactly where the enemy soldiers are hiding. His human eyes cannot pierce the brilliant oak leaf camouflage, but he knows absolutely that they are firing from a specific cluster of trees violently blocking his advance. He does not pull out a heavy brass rangefinder. He does not attempt to calculate complex windage formulas on a wet piece of paper. He simply reaches blindly behind him and grabs the heavy black bakelite handset of the SCR 300 backpack radio strapped to his terrified radio man. He presses the heavy rubber button on the side of the handset and speaks calmly over the loud, crackling static. He reads a simple 6-digit map coordinate. He does not request a single gun. He requests an entire fire mission on that specific grid square. He releases the button and presses his helmet firmly against the damp earth. His job is already done. Miles away deep in the rear echelon, completely removed from the flying bullets and the suffocating smell of dead cattle, that quiet voice echoes out of a small canvas speaker. Inside a large, heavily camouflaged canvas tent, men are operating with the frantic, perfectly choreographed precision of a massive metropolitan telephone switchboard. This is the Fire Direction Center, the absolute brain of the American war machine. A heavy cigar-smoking sergeant wearing a headset immediately repeats the coordinates. Men stand over a massive paper map laid flat across a folding wooden table. They instantly push a colored metal pin directly into the grid square the young lieutenant just called out. The mathematical men inside this tent do not calculate the firing solution for just one single artillery piece. They calculate the firing solutions for dozens of heavy guns simultaneously. Through a complex network of field telephones, they bark specific elevation numbers and powder charge increments to multiple artillery battalions spread miles apart across the French countryside. At the gun lines, the action is brutally physical. The heavy steel breech blocks of the 105mm howitzers slam shut with a deafening metallic clang that rings in the teeth of the gun crews. The massive, beautifully machined long barrels of the 155mm long toms are rapidly cranked toward the sky by men with soot-stained faces and bleeding knuckles. The gunners grip the braided firing lanyards tight, waiting for the precise command. The American artillery officers execute a devastating tactical masterpiece officially known as time on target. Because the massive guns are physically located at completely different distances from the target, the high explosive shells must fly through the air for different lengths of time. The men inside the Fire Direction Center calculate these flight times perfectly down to the single second. They do not fire the guns all at once. They fire the batteries furthest away first. Then a few seconds later, they fire the closer batteries. The heavy shells are violently ejected from the steel barrels, with earth-shattering concussions. They arch high into the clouds, leaving faint gray trails of smoke. They cross paths high in the freezing stratosphere. Dozens of heavy steel projectiles, weighing up to 95 pounds, each converging perfectly in the sky. They fly completely silently toward the earth, descending at a terrifyingly steep angle. They are mathematically engineered to arrive at the exact same location at the exact same fraction of a second. In the dense, dark hedgerows where the German veterans lie perfectly hidden, there is absolutely no warning. There is no single ranging shot falling 100 yards away, giving them precious seconds to dive deep into their muddy foxholes. There is no time to press their hands over their ears. There is only a sudden, terrifying rushing sound descending rapidly from the clouds. It sounds exactly like 100 heavy freight trains tearing violently through the sky simultaneously. The sky directly above the ancient wooden hedgerow simply rips completely open. An area the size of 3 American football fields is violently and instantaneously vaporized in an apocalyptic storm of blinding yellow fire and jagged razor-sharp steel. The immense concussive shockwave of dozens of high-explosive shells detonating at the exact same millisecond crushes the breath right out of a man's lungs long before the hot shrapnel even reaches his skin. Massive ancient oak trees that have stood for 300 years are violently uprooted and thrown through the air like fragile wooden toothpicks. The earthen banks are pulverized into a massive, choking cloud of gray dust and boiling black smoke. When the yellow cordite smoke finally drifts away on the summer breeze, the landscape has been completely erased. The thick, green, impenetrable maze of the bocage has been transformed into the dead, cratered surface of the moon. The elite German paratroopers, wearing the most sophisticated, scientifically engineered optical camouflage ever designed in human history, have been completely wiped from the face of the earth. Their magnificent camouflage had perfectly concealed their physical bodies from the human eye. but it could not conceal a printed 6-digit grid square on an American topographical map. The German military had built its entire defensive doctrine around the individual skill of the hidden sniper. They expected a cautious infantry duel. The Americans answered by dropping the sky on top of them, but this overwhelming display of explosive firepower was only possible because of a terrifying logistical reality operating thousands of miles away. To understand how the American army could afford to blindly erase entire forests with high explosives, one must look far away from the blood-soaked fields of Europe. One must look across the freezing gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean to a nation that had successfully turned an entire continent into a single, unstoppable factory. The German war machine operated on a philosophy of artisanal perfection. Deep in the heavily bombed industrial valleys of the Ruhr, master craftsmen painstakingly milled heavy armor plate for the formidable Tiger tanks. They carefully polished optical lenses by hand until the glass was perfectly flawless. They treated war as an extension of their legendary engineering heritage, producing magnificent, highly complex weapons in relatively tiny quantities. It was a boutique approach to mass slaughter. Across the freezing, violent expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the United States of America viewed the war entirely through the cold, calculating lens of mass production. They did not build weapons as individual works of art. They built weapons as disposable industrial commodities. The American factories did not stop when the sun went down. The massive steel foundries of Pennsylvania and the sprawling automobile plants of Michigan roared 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The night skies over Detroit glowed a hellish burning orange from the relentless heat of the blast furnaces. Millions of American women tied their hair back in heavy bandanas and stepped onto the deafening factory floors. They operated massive hydraulic presses that slammed down with earth-shattering force, stamping out millions upon millions of heavy brass artillery casings. They stood at endless moving conveyor belts, pouring boiling liquid high explosives into the heavy, forged steel bodies of the shells. The sheer, terrifying volume of this production was beyond human comprehension. The American military was not fighting a war of individual battles. They were fighting a war of supreme industrial mathematics. They intended to physically bury the German army under a mountain of mass-produced steel. To transport this unfathomable mountain of destruction from the deep cargo holds of the Liberty ships floating off the Normandy coast to the bloody front lines, the Americans constructed a desperate logistical miracle. They called it the Red Ball Express. It was a massive, endless conveyor belt of heavy canvas, covered trucks moving relentlessly over the shattered French road network. Thousands of young, exhausted truck drivers gripped heavy wooden steering wheels with calloused, blistering hands. They drove massive 2.5-ton cargo trucks through blinding rainstorms, thick, choking dust, and total pitch-black darkness. They were strictly forbidden from turning on their headlights at night to avoid attracting the lethal attention of the German Luftwaffe. They drove completely blind, navigating purely by the dim glowing slits of the blackout drive markers on the truck ahead of them. The heavy rubber tires chewed the muddy French dirt roads into deep, treacherous trenches. The deafening roar of the heavy gasoline engines never ceased. If a truck broke down violently on the side of the road, the driver did not stop to wait for a specialized mechanic. He simply shoved the massive broken vehicle completely off the road into a ditch and climbed into the cab of the next passing truck. The cargo was far more important than the vehicle itself. The heavy wooden crates stacked high inside those swaying canvas trucks contained the very lifeblood of the time-on-target artillery doctrine. The endless roaring convoys delivered hundreds of thousands of high-explosive artillery shells directly to the muddy gun lines every single day. The American artillery officers never had to nervously count their ammunition. They possessed an unlimited bottomless well of destruction feeding a colossal machine that absolutely refused to starve. Yet even with this overwhelming avalanche of mass-produced ammunition, the American military faced a stubborn physical limitation on the battlefield. The high-explosive artillery shell was a terrifying weapon, but it was heavily restricted by the simple mechanics of its detonation. For centuries, artillery shells relied on a basic point, detonating fuse. The heavy steel shell had to physically strike a solid object to trigger the internal explosion. When a heavy artillery shell slammed deeply into the soft, muddy earth of a French farm field, the resulting explosion was massive but heavily contained. The blast blew a massive crater in the dirt, throwing tons of pulverized soil high into the air. But the lethal, jagged steel shrapnel flew sharply upward and outward in a distinct V-shape. For the elite German infantryman dug deep into a narrow slit trench, this impact detonation offered a crucial margin of survival. If the shell did not land directly inside his narrow, muddy hole, the surrounding earth absorbed the vast majority of the lethal horizontal shrapnel. He simply pressed his helmet tightly against the bottom of the trench, let the heavy shower of dirt rain down over his back, and popped back up to fire his weapon. To defeat the protection of the trench, the artillery shell needed to explode high in the air directly above the hidden soldier. This required a mechanical time fuse. Artillerymen had to meticulously calculate the exact flight time and manually twist a small metal dial on the nose of the shell to detonate at a precise second. But in the fluid, chaotic reality of combat setting, a mechanical timer perfectly was nearly impossible. The shells usually exploded far too high in the clouds, scattering harmless metal confetti, or slammed violently into the ground before the timer even ran out. To solve this deadly problem, the American military completely bypassed the traditional weapon designers. They turned directly to the brightest scientific minds working in absolute secrecy deep inside the highly classified laboratories of Johns Hopkins University. These quiet academics wearing wire-rimmed glasses and tweed suits were not interested in better mechanical gears. They were physicists specializing in the invisible manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum. They were tasked with an engineering challenge that bordered on absolute madness. The military demanded a smart fuse. They wanted a tiny radar station capable of continuously broadcasting and receiving radio waves. The true insanity of the request lay in the required scale and durability. This complex electronic radar station, built with incredibly fragile glass vacuum tubes, thin copper wire, and delicate wet cell batteries, had to be shrunk down to the exact size of a common milk bottle. But miniaturization was only the very first impossible hurdle. This tiny, delicate glass brain then had to be screwed tightly onto the nose of a heavy steel artillery shell. It had to flawlessly survive being violently blown out of a steel cannon barrel by pounds of highly combustible gunpowder. The fragile glass tubes had to instantly withstand an unbelievable acceleration force equal to 20,000 times the normal pull of gravity. The shell would exit the smoking muzzle spinning violently at over 200 rotations every single second. The delicate electronics inside had to survive this apocalyptic physical trauma and then function perfectly while flying through the air at supersonic speeds. The scientific triumph of the variable time fuse, or the VT fuse, remains one of the most closely guarded and devastating secrets of the entire war. The brilliant American physicists successfully engineered the impossible. They built a tiny, ruggedized radio transmitter that absolutely thrived in the violent brutality of an artillery launch. The massive shock of the cannon firing physically shattered a tiny glass vial of acid inside the fuse. This acid instantly flooded the tiny battery plates, providing the immediate electrical jolt needed to power up the vacuum tubes. As the heavy steel shell reached the absolute top of its high parabolic arc, and began screaming downward toward the French earth, the tiny transmitter woke up. It began frantically broadcasting a continuous, invisible cone of high-frequency radio waves directly toward the ground. These invisible waves raced downward, completely outpacing the falling shell, struck the wet green grass of the hedgerows, and instantly bounced right back up to the tiny receiver located in the nose. The brilliant electronic brain rapidly calculated the diminishing time between the broadcast and the returning echo. It was physically measuring its exact distance from the ground in real time at supersonic speed. The scientists hardwired the tiny electrical circuit to complete its final task at exactly 50 feet above the ground. The elite German paratrooper, lying motionless at the very bottom of his deep, muddy trench, did not hear the shell physically hit the dirt. He never felt the sudden violent shaking of the earth, because the earth was completely untouched. Exactly 50 feet directly above his open trench, the invisible radio wave triggered the firing pin. The heavy steel shell violently detonated entirely in midair. The blast did not dig a useless hole in the mud. The explosion sent thousands of razor-sharp, jagged steel fragments flying violently straight down into the open trench. The heavy earthen walls of the foxhole provided absolutely zero physical protection from a lethal steel rain falling from the open sky. The ancient hawthorn bushes, the deep, winding, sunken lanes, and the heavily fortified earthen barricades of the bocage were instantly rendered entirely useless. The American war machine had successfully weaponized the very air above the battlefield. The German military had built an unparalleled system of visual concealment and physical entrenchment. But the Americans did not just destroy the soldiers. The American factories, the endless roaring truck convoys, and the quiet, brilliant university physicists combined to systematically dismantle the entire concept of taking cover. The ghost in the hedgerow could no longer hide. And more terrifyingly, he could no longer survive by digging a hole. He was totally exposed to the relentless, crushing weight of an unstoppable industrial empire. As I stood in the ruined remains of my command post in the final chaotic days of the war, I listened to the distant, rhythmic, and absolutely unstoppable rumble of American tanks pushing deeper and deeper into the heart of the fatherland. I had to finally bow my head and confess a bitter, inescapable truth to history. My soldiers did not lose because they lacked courage. They did not lose because they lacked superior tactical training or weapon craftsmanship. They were simply fighting a war that belonged to a vanished past. While the American army had already dragged the entire human race into the terrifying future, the United States Army refused to play by the old, aristocratic, and gentlemanly rules of combat that we had spent centuries refining in the academies of Europe. They completely discarded the cautious, agonizing game of hide-and-seek that defined our defensive doctrine. They replaced our slow, isolated duels of individual infantrymen with a massive, perfectly synchronized industrial war machine. It was a terrifying reality where a single farm boy carrying a semi-automatic rifle wielded the devastating, localized power of an entire 20th century artillery division behind him. My elite paratroopers died in a state of absolute, incomprehensible shock, because they could never understand that victory on this new battlefield did not belong to the army that was best at hiding. Victory belonged entirely to the nation that could forge its raw pragmatism, its towering industrial might, and its brilliant scientific minds into an unstoppable, all-consuming storm of fire. America did not just defeat us on the battlefield in Normandy or in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. They completely redefined how the human race wages war. They proved that the most sophisticated camouflage in existence is rendered entirely irrelevant when your enemy possesses the sheer logistical willpower to saturate every square inch of the map with high-velocity lead and steel. They proved that no amount of physical entrenchment can protect a soldier from a nation that has successfully weaponized the very air above his head. The magnificent, heartbreaking, and truly epic history of this great nation does not belong locked away in cold, dusty, and forgotten textbooks. It is alive. It is pulsing through the veins of this country right now, inside your homes. It echoes in the quiet, humble stories told across your dining room tables every single Thanksgiving. It lives in the faded black and white photographs, kept safe for decades in wooden cigar boxes under the bed. It lives in the vivid, painful, and deeply cherished memories that your fathers, your grandfathers, and the true heroes of the greatest generation carried back across the ocean from the shattered, smoking ruins of Europe. You know these stories. They are the bedrock of your family's identity. The tales of the biting winter cold that seeped into their bones during those long, sleepless nights in a frozen foxhole. The sharp, unforgettable, and ever-present smell of burnt gunpowder that stuck to their wool uniforms for months after they came home. The quiet, unspoken, and lifelong grief for a young, smiling buddy who never made it back home to his mother. These are the sacred, fragile, and absolutely essential fragments of our shared history, and we cannot afford, under any circumstances, to let them fade away into the cold, uncaring shadows of time. If you have a story of a loved one who served in that epic struggle, a memory passed down to you in a whisper, or a piece of gear that still sits on a mantle, please take a moment to share it in the comments below. Let us read their names aloud one more time. Let us collectively honor their incredible, selfless, and world-altering sacrifice, and let us work together with purpose and pride to preserve this proud, unbreakable, and historic legacy for the generations that are yet to come. The soldiers who fought in those hedgerows, German and American both, left us a record clear enough to finally understand. They deserve to be remembered, not as names on a list, but as the men who lived through the crucible of history. We owe it to them, to the truth and to the future, to keep their story visible.